Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Uncovering Archival Materials in AM's Africa and the New Imperialism, European Borders on the African Continent, 1870 to 1914, which is sponsored by AM. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. I'll put some links in the chat where you can find and register for upcoming Choice ACRL webinars and watch previous webinar recordings. Okay, so before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. Also, there is closed captioning available for today's program. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Last, please note that we are recording today's program and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. And with that, we are ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Natalie.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Dale, and I'm a senior editor at AM, and I worked as the supporting editor on the Africa and the New Imperialism resource. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the fantastic material we have in this resource, the decisions that we make when indexing and making these documents discoverable for researchers, and a little bit about our interactive map feature as well. So this resource includes material from archives around the world, including the Bodleian Library, British Film Institute, the School of African and Oriental Studies at the University of London, Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Sanford Museum in Florida, and the National Archives UK. This is an extensive resource covering the period of colonial expansion within Africa from 1870 to 1914, which had a huge impact on African peoples and the continent that we see today. And when working with primary source material, we think very carefully about the different ways in which we can make these documents discoverable for researchers. So each document has been tagged with information such as region, document type, language, and library or archive details. And we've also applied HTR and OCR transcription across materials so that users can navigate more easily to key terms of interest where they appear in the transcript when performing searches. Our searching guides offer guidance on finding hidden narratives, people, places, and events, as well as more information on different browsing pathways and considering the language that's used in these historic documents so that researchers can find relevant documents more easily. It's really important for students coming to this material for the first time to understand the context of this material. So we have a range of supporting content such as essays, biographies, and a guide to regions and places. The essays explore a number of different topics, including using maps in research, religion, resistance to colonialism, colonial violence, women in Africa, economics, and reading against the grain. We also have guides to the archival collections, which provide context on the archival collections themselves and the documents that we've included within this resource. And one feature that I wanted to talk to you about in a little more detail today is our interactive map feature. So this was a huge undertaking, and while we were researching the best ways of approaching this, we uncovered several challenges. So this is a period of intense conflict with constantly shifting boundaries. And in our own research, we found that lots of existing maps didn't include pre-colonial areas. And we thought that this was really important to include, but we also knew that there'd be difficulties in mapping pre-colonial areas, as we unfortunately don't necessarily have a complete picture of the indigenous peoples and places that were there before this period of conflict and colonial rule. So we knew sourcing this information would be a challenge, and we wanted to make sure that if we were to map pre-colonial areas, we wanted to do that as sensitively and accurately as possible to move away from this very sort of Western perspective of only mapping land claimed by European powers. So there were several factors we were considering when researching how to create this feature. And what we kept coming back to was that at its core, this is a really powerful tool in allowing users and undergraduate students in particular to visualize and to comprehend the speed and scale of colonial expansion and the impact that this had on the people who were living there. And you can see, if I move from this 1870 view to 1915, the speed at which the claims on Africa have changed in this very short period of time. The map includes a timeline which explores the events and the power dynamics across Africa in 5-year periods from 1870 to 1915. And we've included contextual information on the key events that happened during each period, and included document highlights and information on a number of key figures from Africa and from Europe. The map interacts with the timeline so that users can see how the claims on areas across Africa change over time. And each document is highlighted in the map itself, so you can see there on the right. They've all been tagged with a location which corresponds to the map. In initial research, we did find that similar maps had a very sort of Eurocentric approach, as I mentioned. So using a number of primary and secondary sources, we've included, where possible, pre-colonial place names in our metadata for the map, and document highlights which include African voices rather than sort of just showing a blank space for any areas unclaimed by European powers. We've also tried to be really transparent about the challenges that there are in working with maps. So we've linked to a contextual essay by Lindsay Frederick Braun, which explores using maps in historical research and making sure that this is prominently placed on the landing page for the maps feature. And we've also added information that explains to users that where we haven't been able to find surviving information on particular Indigenous peoples and that area appears unpopulated, this actually just reflects a gap in our knowledge on who was in that area at that time. So we wanted to speak to the gaps and the reasons for those as well. We also have a commitment to accessibility in our products, and we wanted to ensure that we met WCAG standards with our use of colour, and that we didn't rely solely on colour to denote different areas. We worked very closely with HuMap, who developed this feature, to find a solution to this. And instead of using a different colour for each claim to land, we've kept to 2 colours, so the blue representing Indigenous powers and brown representing colonial powers, and we've added pattern overlays to represent the different claims. And we've also added a key to help users navigate these different patterns and how they relate to the changes you can see on the map through time. Each visualization, which you can see as you move through the timeline, has been individually traced, and we've conducted extensive research into who was living in these areas at each point in the timeline. And as I mentioned, we've also added contextual information on what was happening in Africa at each 5-year period. So we've included examples of colonial violence, misinformation, and stealing of resources, and the impact that this had on the people of Africa. And this is a topic which Michelle has covered in her essay included in this resource. I wanted to finish by talking briefly about one individual, King Mwanga II of Buganda, who's referenced in the map and who resisted British colonial rule. He launched an attack on British forces and was imprisoned, but somehow, against the odds, managed to escape with a rebel army and launched a second attack. And he was exiled to the Seychelles in 1899, and he spent the rest of his life in exile. And the reason I mentioned this one is that there are many different examples which can be covered in the resource of resistance to colonial rule and to colonial violence. And I would encourage anyone who's looking to research this to explore the essays and the searching guide to find out more on this area. And I will now hand over to Michelle Moyd, who will be talking to you in a little more detail about reading African experiences in the archives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalie. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Of course, as I sat down to do this, I now hear people outside my window cutting the grass. So I put my earbuds in, and hopefully that blocks it out. So I wanted to, well, first of all, thanks to Natalie and the organizers for inviting me to do this, and to giving me an opportunity to talk about the little bit of research that I did in this collection. So in the essay that I wrote to accompany this database, which Natalie just mentioned, I argued that the digitized archives included in this vast collection have much to offer for scholars and students who want to understand colonial violence and its effects in Africa between 1870 and 1914 and beyond, actually. Equally important are the ways that these collections provide evidence of the myriad ways that African peoples across the continent and across time rejected, fought against, accommodated, and lived with colonialism. And I'll just advance the slides one here. Yeah, I'll leave it there for a moment. So I struggled with writing the essay for a number of reasons. Prominent among them were feelings of overwhelm with the sheer volume of materials the database makes available to those who can access it. I ended up looking at a lot of different files within various collections, and in the end decided I would write about a theme that interested me, which is European colonial looting of sacred objects, and the theft of human remains is something that's on my mind right now, in a location that I wanted to learn more about. So I'm actually a historian of East Africa. I ended up focusing on Nigeria, in part because I just felt like that was a history I wanted to be immersed in. So I ended up focusing on one specific file from the Bodleian collection that held evidence about the Royal Niger Company, which was one of the companies that operated in what is now Nigeria in the late 1880s and 1890s. And just very briefly, I don't want to go into this in great detail, but companies like the RNC were kind of the one of the formative steps towards formal colonization and colonial processes. And they were active actors in laying the groundwork for what later became formal colonial governance structures. So I'm just looking at one of those. Royal Niger Company is a British example. There are countless other examples across the continent, all kind of operating at roughly the same time. So it was run by a vice governor named George Taubman Goldie, whose writings make up a significant portion of the file. It includes correspondence between him and people like Frederick Lugard, who at the time was hired by the RNC to secure treaties and arrangements with indigenous peoples to counter French and German expansion in the region. What I tried to show in my readings of these documents are the ways that even when colonial officials don't directly reference violence, so what we might think of, what immediately comes to mind are, physical attacks, raids, warfare, etc. So even when they're not directly referencing those kinds of, those forms of violence, many documents still reveal evidence of the multifaceted harms and forms of violence that were inflicted on African peoples by white colonizers. So to my mind, the violence is always right there, hiding in plain sight, even if the central topic is not violence per se, in the ways that students might be thinking about it or searching for in a kind of cursory overview of research material. So I just put up this map as a way of orienting you to the area that I'll be talking about today. Especially in the second part of my remarks, I'll be talking about this area here, Akassa, and then further up in this area, Nembe, and a few other locations, all kind of in the Niger Delta area. And this map, by the way, shows Nigeria in 1914 after the so-called amalgamation of Nigeria happened under Frederick Lugard. So I'm going to talk about a specific instance of RNC violence shortly, but first I thought I would show you a couple of examples of what these documents can tell us about African perspectives on colonialism. I didn't write about these specific materials in the essay that I wrote a few months ago, but I did write about treaties that I found in the same Bodleian file that I've been describing so far. So the ones that I'm going to show you next, and I'm sorry these are so small, but I can talk through them quickly just to show what I found interesting about them. So these come from Foreign Office files. So these come from the National Archive at Kew in the UK, and it's the series FO, Foreign Office. And it's a file called Treaties, Royal Niger Company, HBM, and Native Chiefs. And what I found interesting about this file is that it shows many different examples of treaties that were treaties that were signed between the RNC and indigenous peoples in what is now Nigeria. And each one of these documents is kind of a statement about how the British perceived certain local polities and who their leaders were. It also reveals some more interesting information that I'll try to highlight. So just to kind of let you know what you're looking at, and I put them all on one slide in order to just keep them together so I wouldn't have 6 different slides. It says Royal Niger Company, and then it says, it gives the name of the polity that they're signing with. It gives the date. So in this case, it's 19th of July, 1889. And then it goes through on a pre-printed form and sort of outlines what the expectations are between the treaty signers. At the very end here, there's a list of so-called chiefs with their names. And then over here, it says his mark. And these X's that are listed next to their names are the mark that these men supposedly made in order to indicate that they understood what was contained in the treaty. On this very last page, I don't know if I can make this larger from here. I wish I could, I'm sorry, but I can't even see it myself at this point. But so the declaration by interpreter. So this last document is what I find most interesting because it gives us a glimpse of the intermediary, the person who did the work of translating between the RNC representative and these local political figures who put their mark on the document. And in this case, it says, I, Shu Fly, native of Brass. So Brass is the area that I was showing you on the map. And then it goes on from there to kind of as his testament to the fact that he has translated what went on in discussions between these two parties, or these many parties actually. And then, the usual in terms of dates and such. He too has to make a mark, which indicates that he's not literate in at least in this language, in English, right? And probably not at all. What also is interesting about this is the name, right? Shu Fly suggests that this is a nickname given either by he himself or whoever hired him as an intermediary, which tells you perhaps something about the kinds of power relations between the interpreter and whoever brought him on board to do the interpreting. Now, to move on quickly, because I see time is flying by. This is another treaty from the same collection a few pages later. And this time the treaty is with Ogidi. It's in May of 1890, same form. And what I'm interested in here, and I'm sorry this got cut off somehow in my, I guess while I was shifting things around. What's interesting about the translator here is that his name is listed as Robert Taylor. And rather than making a mark, he actually signs his own name here. And it turns out in this case that he is from Sierra Leone, possibly a member of the West African Frontier Force, or associated with the West African Frontier Force. There were many Sierra Leoneans who were working alongside British companies and such in this time frame, although perhaps not this early. But in any case, it suggests that he's coming from outside of this immediate region and in some capacity working alongside the British. And note the anglicized, the Anglophone name there as well. Okay, so let me quickly proceed, and I'm happy to come back to talking about the treaties if people are interested. So in this next part, I wanted to talk through some interesting and horrifying events that happened in this region in 1895 and afterwards. And here again, a map just to remind you of the area that I'll be discussing, which is Brass, broadly defined or broadly named Brass. That's kind of a regional name. But people that lived in this area often were referred to as brassmen. And I'll be talking about NIMBY here, Brass, and then also a little town in here, Fishtown. On the 29th of January, 1895, NIMBY combatants, so again, often referred to as brassmen, as you can see in the title of this image, attacked the Royal Niger Company's headquarters at Akassa. So just quickly, that would be somewhere in here. Actually, it's here, it's labeled on the map. Which sat at the mouth of the Niger River, destroying it. They killed 25 employees and took prisoners back to Nembe. The RNC in turn organized a devastating military response against Nembe and other towns, and then other towns that were perceived to be involved in the Akassa attack. This so-called punitive expedition included the use of 2 warships and some 300,000 troops. Nembe and other towns were destroyed through shelling and the deliberate burning of houses and other buildings, and the seizure of war canoes, one of which you can see represented here. This was published in the Daily Graphic in March of 1895, so actually in the midst of the conflict as it was still kind of unfolding. Some 300 Nembe were killed in these attacks, and according to the historian E.J. Alagoa, who was one of the first to kind of write about this from a Nigerian perspective, quote, "The places that had bustled with life were desolate." A few months later, I'm going to skip this for now because you don't really need to know about the colonial officials that much. They were more there for illustration. But a few months later, a kind of renowned colonial explorer, person who had been all over the continent in various capacities, named John Kirk, wrote a report on the events in Brass, where he kind of assessed what had happened there and made note that while he thought the British response to the attack on Akassa had been disproportionate and overly destructive, he also didn't see any other way around it. I mean, if you want to have empire, then you have to be able to stop people from doing these sorts of things. So he, in the end, sort of tried to play it in the middle, but the ultimate answer was that this is what empire requires. Part of what he wrote about was his observation that peoples who had fled from their destroyed towns and villages were beginning to return and to rebuild. And so as I was preparing for today, I started to look at some other materials, trying to find things that I hadn't looked at before. And I came across this photo album in the National Library of Scotland materials, which is a photo album put together by John Kirk, the same person who wrote this report. And it's the actual title of the album is, or the collection name for it is Album of Photographs Taken by Kirk While in West Africa and Cornwall, 1895 to 1897. So most of the pictures are from West Africa, but then at the very end of it, there's a whole series of pictures from Cornwall and Penzance, and it's a very odd experience to be flipping through and sort of seeing his random way of putting these pictures together. But was that at the bottom you can see eyes of in Kirk's eye, as he wrote in the report, people who actually the attacks unfriendly to British interests in the extreme. At the top, he writes, "These are the people reported by Sir Claude MacDonald as starving." Sir Claude MacDonald was the British consul general in the area who had also been reporting on what he was seeing in the area in the wake of the attacks and the British punitive expedition. So what I just want to point out here is the kind of interesting, the ways that you can look at photography as evidence. Do a lot of analysis here, but I think it's, there are a lot of ways this is a, very tight grouping of 20 to 30 African, and it looks like mostly men, and and a number of them are looking directly at the camera, arms crossed. There's some defiance, I would interpret as some defiance or dissatisfaction with the photography taking place. This is the photograph that immediately follows that one, and again, kind of a tight grouping there, and the same sorts of facial expressions and body language. The next photo in the series says Fishtown Stockade after capture. And I think an image like this could be used to talk about, the kinds of defenses that African peoples had, that they built for themselves in order to protect their own interests and livelihoods and lives. Not clear what Kirk and I'm not sure long some kind of links are points for further discussion about defenses. Okay, I'm going to turn off my camera on the advice of staff, and I'm almost done. This is the last image that I'll show, which is next in the series in Kirk's photo album. And here I'm just noting that this is his picture of Casa, which is the site of the RNC's headquarters, which was destroyed by the brass combatants. So I'll just wrap up here by saying a little later in the photo album, and I didn't include these in the presentation, that there are a couple of images of brass objects. And again, in his very sort of brief cryptic commentary, he writes underneath these brass items, dug up from alluvial soil near Wari, and there's no further commentary. So one is left to wonder, did he take them back to England? Did he, who dug them up? Did he dig them up? And most importantly, whose brass bells were they? So this photographic evidence is another window into the violence done during colonialism, in which objects like these were stolen from indigenous peoples, removed from lands with possibly sacred meanings and ancestral ties, and put on display in museums in Europe and elsewhere. I didn't include them in the slides today, but these are a stark reminder that the everyday violence of colonialism can appear at any moment in the archives. This digitization project can make researching these questions much more accessible to students. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Can I just second Michelle by thanking Natalie, Sabrina, and the team for making this happen, for the work they've done addressing some of the challenges and considerations that are involved in the researching of modern African and imperial history. So I think it now really goes without saying that historians are painfully conscious of the challenges involved in using the archives, usually constructed by white European males, and of the risks that we run of being held captive by such individuals' efforts at self-curation and self-presentation. African societies were for so long reconstructed as a result of these processes as passive recipients of colonial policy and control. And I think one of the things that this collection does really well is gives us quite a multifaceted way of exploring the ways in which African agency kind of cuts against this. And Michelle's given one example of this. And the example I wanted to talk about in the short time available concerns vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities that arose at various points in European attempts at colonial subjugation, and which arose as a direct result of African activity. And I think the richness of the archives really enables us to trace imperialism as an encounter. It's not just a system. It's an encounter, it's negotiated, it's contingent. This enables us then to trace some of the specifics of the imperial encounter. And one of the ways that we can do this is by looking at a gap. There's a gap between what the Europeans were projecting at their most confident, their most self-aggrandizing on the one hand, and on the other, what they expressed at moments when African resistance punctured such self-aggrandizement. So for all of the colonial conquest was marked by technological disparity, particularly the means to enact violence, as Michelle was talking about. There are noted instances of resistance and quite sustained resistance in some cases. And this obviously has knock-on consequences for European attempts to project authority. So, which is so important, because so much of imperialism is powered by a performative element. And this in turn makes it particularly important for us to consider the human element again, because imperial figures of all types are keen to project a confident authority. One of the most enduring conflicts the British had in Africa in the 19th century, just a little bit along the coast from Michelle's case study, is the Asante Empire in what is now Ghana, but which at the turn of the 20th century had an unstable relationship with the emerging British colony of the Gold Coast. Anglo-Asante wars had marked the modern era ever since the 1820s. Other areas surrounding this region were already under what the British referred to as protection. The lands controlled by the state known as the Asante Man were the last to be pacified, again, to use the sort of phrase the Europeans employed to justify their actions. So our case study for the next few months is a site of long-standing conflict and resistance to colonial control. That is the backdrop to what we're just about to look at. So what we've got in 1900, British-led forces are fighting against the Asante Queen Mother. There she is on the left, Yara Santiwa. She's a noted fighter, still commemorated today in present-day Ghana. She and her forces have laid siege to a fort. They've laid siege to a fort, a British-held fort in Kumasi, the city of Kumasi. The men on the right, they are pictured in this fort at this time. Now, by the end of 1900, the rebellion was to be crushed, with Yara Santiwa and other Asante elites sent into exile, again in the Seychelles. Asante territory was consolidated with others into the Gold Coast. And the present collection of sources gives us the chance to see how this conflict played out in official testimonies. So Sir James Wilcox, pictured here in this rather strange photograph, he's the Colonel Commandant of the West African Frontier Force. He's led the fight against the Asante. And on the 24th of November 1900, Wilcox reported from Kumasi back to the Colonial Office in London. And he's reporting that resistance against the British has ended. Areas where, and I quote, barbarous cruelties had been carried out against British subjects were completely destroyed, together with all villages which have helped fight against us and their farms. This exemplary punishment has prevented all resistance. Wilcox continued that the campaign against the Asante Empire was now, quote, at an end, and that the enemy, helped by 6 months' incessant rains, have learned that they cannot resist the authority of the Queen even under conditions most favourable to them. So Wilcox clearly exultant here. He's clearly attempting to create this kind of narrative of inevitability, that a rebellion facing a force with the Queen at its figurehead could not hope to win, even if the local odds are stacked in Africans' favour. But this is triumphalism expressed after what the British judged to be the end of the event. Resistance here is judged to be at an end. So at this point, we have the British, as I say, at their most defiant. The tone they're taking in the middle of the violence is very different indeed. In the middle of things, in the spring, before Wilcox is expressing victory in those triumphalist terms, banging on about the Queen, the governor of the Gold Coast, Sir Frederick Hodgson, is worried. And he's worried that opposition to the British is not going away. On the contrary, he feels it's growing. He's trying to press those people higher on up the food chain to give him more troops, to get more troops brought in from elsewhere. He feels that in order to prevent this opposition from spreading, he needs to, quote, make a display of superior force, a display that would have necessitated the bringing in of troops from elsewhere within the empire, which at that point was not forthcoming. Indeed, the tone taken in the middle of the fighting is so different, it's almost hard to believe it's sometimes the same people involved who were only a few months or even a few weeks before the end of the warfare saying very different things. So during the conflict, Wilcox is bombarding the Colonial Office with updates. He's got this big list of all the problems that they're facing. He's saying there's a real kind of, this is a really serious issue. He said that rebel forces are assuming very large proportions. So he's worried. And you could say, now, this is just pressure for the sake of trying to twist the arm of the authorities just to get more manpower. But if you consider those papers alongside other ones that are also held in the collection, private papers, you compare the public papers to the private papers, you can triangulate a further conclusion. And here we can look at northern Nigeria. So the High Commissioner, Frederick Lugard, he's confiding to his brother in a private letter that, quote, Kumasi is surrounded and they are in a very tight place. He reports that there is a serious crisis. Now, Lugard's brother isn't in a position to be able to do anything about this. So behind the scenes, I think the anxiety then is quite genuine. The pushback against what the British believed to be a growing rebellion faced significant shortages, not just personnel and ammunition, but also food and access to reliable intelligence. And on the 8th of May, with rebels pressing the Kumasi fort, you get this from the materials in the collection, Hodgson, he's suggesting that the situation of the affairs was very serious. And he's calculating that the garrison inside the fort has to be relieved within 3 weeks. Otherwise, they're going to run out of food. Now, when it becomes clear to those inside the fort that a relief expedition isn't imminent and they faced a period of half rations, hunger forces a portion of the British to endeavour to break the siege early one morning in July. They're too weak for direct confrontation with the rebels, where those rebels are in their greatest number. They're harried on their march of, quote, great difficulty and privation after having witnessed terrible scenes of mortality. All in all, Hodgson wrote, these have been anxious and trying times. When the situation turns, and when Kumasi is eventually relieved, and when the siege is lifted in the middle of July, Wilcox notes that the garrison inside was, quote, delighted beyond words. British officers thanked God for relief, as a few more days would have seen the last of the defence. So we've got the sort of emotions that don't conform with the imperialist stereotype of the stiff upper lip. And it's worth noting again at the type of sources we are looking at here. These are not only private sources, the letters passed between friends, where one might expect emotions to come to the surface when soldiers and administrators are at their lowest ebb, but also the official correspondence, the material that is passed from the people on the ground to London. Now, in their own interests, these people on the ground would have been aware of the problem that going nuclear in their criticisms of their superiors would have posed for their future prospects. Now, of course, vulnerabilities and a sense of vulnerability could be mobilized by such individuals in the hope of bringing about a change in their circumstances, trying to shock London into providing more troops, for instance. But the fact that such frustrations should arise here at all, and in the way that they did, is testament to just how difficult such officials could find things. However much they later professed that there was only ever going to be one outcome, and that it will be one favourable to the British, by using a mixture of private and official correspondence, tracking that over a period of time within the collection. What can we see? We can map directly the consequences of African resistance to colonial invasion.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much to Natalie, Michelle, and Chris for your presentations. I think we've reached the Q&A portion of the discussion. So for our attendees, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. Great. And I think just to get us started, Natalie, I know you talked a lot about AM's maps feature in the beginning of the presentation. And I was just wondering if you could talk more about the thought process of creating more interactive and visual tools for archival research.
Yeah, I touched on this a little bit, but essentially, I mean, we've really just touched the surface in this webinar in terms of the drastic changes that happen in that continent during that time. And the thing that we kept coming back to when we kept talking to our editorial board was that it's really, really difficult to comprehend just how quickly these encounters sort of took over the land there and changed the lives of the people there, and really sort of shaped the continent in the way that we can see it today, and completely destroyed it in many ways. I think we really needed a visual tool, particularly for undergraduate students, for users coming to this material for the first time, to be able to see that on a very sort of top level. And obviously with the interactive map features as well, then we can create sort of jumping off points into the material itself, so that they can explore the collection more widely. And it also gave us that opportunity to provide that context as well about what's actually happening during these different periods. So yes, loads of different reasons, but essentially the big one is just being able to provide that visual tool.
Great. Okay. Yeah, looks like we have some questions here. First one from Jesse, and this is to both Chris and Michelle. I would love to hear if either of you have worked with the archive in your teaching, and if so, how have you used it?
I'm happy to start here. So obviously this is a brand new resource, so I haven't had time yet to incorporate this within my my teaching. But it is exactly the sort of thing that I will be using in the future. I run what's in the UK is called a special subject. It's a final year big module, kind of one of the finales to an undergraduate program in history, which includes very, very intensive use of the primary sources. It's a no lecture module. It's just seminars, 4 hours of seminars every week, where you're just getting your hands dirty with the primary sources. And I've used a lot of these materials in the past, but it's been off my own back, having to go into the archives and collecting them. Now I'm going to be able to say to the students, well, you go and do it yourself. You can find this stuff out for yourself now. So it's exactly that the Foreign Office stuff, the materials on the ground from individuals that I was talking about and Michelle was talking about, it's there. This is the good stuff in terms of teaching about the colonial state in Africa in the late 19th, early 20th century.
Great. And Michelle?
Yeah, I have not used them yet. I'm hoping to start maybe using some of them next fall when I teach a course on the history of East Africa, because there's some great stuff that I ended up not pursuing because I got interested in the Nigeria stuff, but there's some great stuff on conflict that occurred in Kenya. There's stuff on Zanzibar. There's, I mean, so yeah, I haven't done it yet, but there's plenty there.
Great, okay. And we have another question here from Michael. And Michael asks, a question for Chris. Do you have thoughts on ways to associate and or link seemingly separate materials, like public versus personal, in archives via finding aids or other means?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I think when you're teaching this kind of thing, like with the special subject that I mentioned, you do have to provide students initially, at least, with a kind of a curated path through this. So my expectation with using some of this kind of material would be in the first few weeks of the semester, you'd be providing students with a sampling, perhaps kind of clustered around a case study such as Michelle or I have talked about, where you do precisely this. You embed URLs within a kind of a virtual learning environment such as Blackboard that gives them a kind of a curated engagement with the different means by which Europeans are engaging with African spaces, the public and the private, but also then within that, the missionary, the trader, the explorer, traveler. You know, I appreciate that some of those categories overlap sometimes, but then as well as the colonial administrator, civilian and military. I think in the first instance, you kind of want to I'd probably create a kind of curated list of different types of engagement, different types of sources, and then try and wean the students off that as the semester progresses, and then kind of expect that they're making the kind of linkages, and kind of, if we're engaging with something of the moment, really like the history of emotion, which is kind of what I was touching on today, where we are kind of asked them to kind of like, okay, you find a case study, you find examples of the public, you find examples of the private, you triangulate.
Great, okay, thank you. And looks like we have a question for Natalie from Leslie, who asks, I'm wondering what platform was used for the maps and to annotate them.
Yeah, so I touched on this briefly, but we worked with a provider called HuMap, and essentially they work with sort of archives, libraries, different institutions, and they are a big support in creative. So they have their own software, and they really sort of support you in building these different features. So we worked very closely with them. We provided the data to them, and we talked very extensively about what we needed this map to show and how we were going to do it. So we sort of like not built the tools together, but definitely sort of built the data together. And we had a lot of input on the design and things as well, particularly around the accessibility requirements that I was talking about earlier.
Great, okay. So another question from Brennan, and I think anyone can answer this, but I know the collection primarily focuses on the colonial encounter, but do any of the resources relate to earlier pre-colonial history?
Should I take this one? So, sorry, Michelle.
Well, I was just going to say that, you know, I don't have a sense of the whole scope of the collection. I just haven't had enough time. But I think there are some ways to think about even what is cast as colonial as providing glimpses of the pre-colonial, and it's important to problematize those terms. Increasingly, I think more and more scholarship is trying to undo some of the ways we think about this. But to keep it simple, the image that I showed, for example, of the war canoe, the Nembe war canoe, that is a clear example of a style of warfare that is adapted to the Niger Delta region that goes way back, right? I mean, this is a way of war that is a part of life in the Niger Delta, with or without the colonists. So the fact that they use this war canoe to attack RNC headquarters at Akassa is, I think, an interesting moment to interrogate what we mean by colonial versus pre-colonial, because the war canoes were an effective means of going to war in this environment. And the British came back with their own version of naval warfare, and it caused mass and disproportionate destruction to the whole region, right? So, so I think that is one way to think about, even if things aren't necessarily available with the label pre-colonial on them, there are materials within the collections that are ostensibly about colonialism that are actually directly referencing African life before the colonizers.
Yeah, that's a great point. Does anyone want to add to that, or?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think Michelle's absolutely is bang on there, and I think I think it's absolutely right, kind of to complicate the boundary between pre-colonial and colonial. One of the things that Indigenous elites, such as chiefs, are very keen to do when the British and the French and others arrive, is to narrate their own histories in order to justify their own claims to territory. So you have to kind of look at it through that lens, but you do have, quite strong, quite pronounced examples, which are very important for Africanists, where you've got where the pre-colonial stuff is revealed through the colonial. So you have colonial officials arriving in an area, they haven't got a clue about this place. Like, how do I negotiate this area? I've just got this kind of vague sense of Africa as this kind of generic blank bit on the map. And they're going around and they're talking to elites, and elites see this as an opportunity for them to kind of leverage what kind of agency or what kind of room for maneuver they have in the circumstances of kind of encroaching European dominance. And they will start to tell their own stories, as I say, that kind of justify their position against a rival ethnic grouping in the neighboring area. So you've got the kind of the built culture, the technology that Michelle's talking about, but you've also got kind of very kind of rich historical textual stuff. Now, you obviously got to use that with a kind of a grain of salt, because there's an agenda, there's a reason why these elites are kind of wanting to tell these particular stories. But I think you give that to a student and you go, right, what can you tell about pre-colonial periods? Okay, with that caveat, from a colonial era document. That's a kind of a great exercise, thinking of this as a teaching aid.
Well, and the photography too. I didn't show you the images of the brass bells, but the fact that Kirk or somebody in his midst dug these up from alluvial soil around Wari is also another indicator of how African life before the colonizers comes up in the archives, in addition to the photographs of the people in Fishtown. And I mean, there are many different, the stockade, all of these are kinds of evidence that can bring to bear in conjunction with other kinds of materials to try to get at some of that. And I really like what you said, Chris, about reading the sources with an eye to those kinds of, almost like reading them ethnographically, right? And kind of as a methodological style.
Yeah, definitely. Natalie, anything to add about the collection?
Just from an editorial point of view, as I think Chris and Michelle have both alluded to how sort of vast this resource is in itself. And I think we do have to consider sort of cut-off points for these resources. And we do have some sort of pre-1870 content, which are more sort of exploratory missions, essentially. And that is included, but the focus is definitely this 1870 to 1915 point. And I would say, we definitely run the risk of becoming too broad sometimes. If we try to cover sort of all of African history in a resource, we would run the risk of having a less rich collection, I would say, in the end.
Got it. Okay, I think that's pretty much it for the questions. If anyone has anything else, feel free to put it in the Q&A, but I think I'll start to wrap up here and thank everyone. So thanks so much to Natalie, Michelle, and Chris for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you to our attendees for your questions and comments. Okay, we might be able to get this one in real quick. Ruby has a question. Could you address the criteria for selection of content? So Natalie, that might be for you.
It is, but I would say that's quite a big question. We have people's email addresses, don't we? So that might be one that I'll follow up with you if that's okay. We do have some information in the resource itself in terms of selection criteria as well, but I'll try and send you a more sort of detailed answer outside of this.
Perfect. Okay. Sounds great. So I'll just remind viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the session and hope to see you again in the near future on another webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.